So we're just beginning our adventure together. Last week we talked about the idea that the creation account was an origin story of sorts. We considered the idea that the story is not ours, it's God's, and we get to be a part of that story. And so as we continue our Advent journey together, our adventure together, I want you to keep thinking about that idea of story. As any good English or literature teacher will tell you, a good story has several key components. And any good plot has an exposition, a rising action, a climax, a falling action, and a conclusion. So we have the luxury of getting to see the whole story, or most of it. We get to see how the Jewish people started. We get to see the rising action. We get to see the climax of Jesus' death and resurrection. And even though we haven't seen the resolution yet, we are confident that we know how the story's going to end. We have a little bit more perspective than the Jewish people did. And we get to see things from a little bit more of a distance. The people that would come to be known as the Jews didn't have that same opportunity. But we get to look in on them as they learn more about who God is. The stories that we read in the first 5 books of the Bible were told out loud over and over again over several generations before they were ever written down. They may have been told on cold nights like this, around a fire just like this. People might have been huddled around a fire to stay warm, and a child might have come up to their father. He might have said, "Tell me again, Daddy, the story about Abraham and Isaac." This is a story that the child would have heard countless times. But just like all the times they've heard it before, this time, when they heard the story, they might hear something different, something new that they didn't catch the first time. So I want you to settle in. I want you to pay attention. I want you to listen. So this is from Genesis chapter 22. Sometime later, God tested Abraham. He said to him, "Abraham." "Here I am," he replied. Then God said, "Take your son, your only son, whom you love, Isaac, and go to the region of Moriah. Sacrifice him there as a burnt offering on a mountain I will show you." Early the next morning, Abraham got up and loaded his donkey. He took with him 2 of his servants and his son Isaac. When he had cut enough wood for the burnt offering, he set out for the place that God had told him about. On the 3rd day, Abraham looked up and saw the place in the distance. He said to his servants, "Stay here with the donkey while I and the boy go over there. We will worship, and then we will come back to you." Abraham took the wood for the burnt offering and placed it on his son Isaac, and he himself carried the fire and the knife. As the 2 of them went on together, Isaac spoke up and said to his father Abraham, "Father." "Yes, my son," Abraham replied. "The fire and wood are here," Isaac said, "but where is the lamb for the burnt offering?" Abraham answered, "God himself will provide the lamb for the burnt offering, my son." And the 2 of them went on together. When they reached the place God had told them about, Abraham built an altar there and arranged the wood on it. He bound his son Isaac and laid him on the altar on top of the wood. Then he reached out his hand and took the knife to slay his son. But the angel of the Lord called out to him from heaven, "Abraham, Abraham." "Here I am," he replied. "Do not lay a hand on the boy," he said. "Do not do anything to him. Now I know that you fear God, because you have not withhold from me your son, your only son." Abraham looked up, and there in a thicket he saw a ram caught by its horns. He went over and took the ram and sacrificed it as a burnt offering instead of his son. So Abraham called the place "The Lord will provide." And to this day it is said, "On the mountain of the Lord it will be provided." The angel of the Lord called to Abraham a second time and said, "I swear by myself, declares the Lord, that because you have done this and have not withheld your son, your only son, I will surely bless you and make your descendants as numerous as the stars in the sky and as the sand on the seashore. Your descendants will take possession of the cities of the enemies, and through their offspring all nations on earth will be blessed, because you have obeyed me." So any person listening to this story at this fire would be thinking not just about this story, but about the whole story of Abraham. They'd be thinking about Abraham's call, his journeys, and the promise that God made to him, that even though he was childless, God told Abraham that Abraham would have a child, an heir, and that all of humanity would be blessed through that heir. They would remember that Abraham tried to fulfill that promise on his own and not on God's terms. And they would remember the strange arrangement that God made with Abraham. God told Abraham that part of the covenant was that Abraham and every male in his family for the rest of time had to be circumcised. And they would also remember the story of Isaac's miraculous birth. So as they listened to and remembered these stories, they would also be thinking about the stories of the other gods from the other tribes, the gods of Mesopotamia and the gods of Babylon. They would be just as familiar with those stories as they would be with the stories of Yahweh. So, for example, when they would hear the creation account in Genesis, they wouldn't necessarily hear that it took 7 days, or that there was a particular order, or that humans were created last. You see, there's another, much older creation story called the Enuma Elish. It's a Babylonian poem that tells its own version of how the world was created. In that poem, different gods created different things on different days, and humans were created as a side effect of some family infighting. The creation account that we read in Genesis follows a very similar pattern, but has a very different emphasis. In Genesis, it is one God who created everything, and humanity was created on purpose, intentionally. So when we hear our story tonight, it's easy to ask, what kind of loving God would make that kind of demand from Abraham? Even if it was just a test, this makes Yahweh look a tad bit sadistic. How cruel is it to promise a man who could not bear a child that he would have a child, only to then ask for that same child to be sacrificed? Who would want to follow a God like that? I think that's an appropriate question to ask. And I think that's a good question. So, what do we do with this story? Much like how we compared the Enuma Elish to the creation account in Genesis, we can learn some things by comparing the stories to similar ideas regarding other gods. You see, child sacrifice was a common occurrence among worshippers of those other pagan gods. And those worshippers could never know if they had appeased their god or not. And it was also the understanding of those cultures that gods got stronger based on how your sacrifice was. The better the sacrifice, the bigger the god. So if we see this story as part of the adventure of the Jews getting to know who their God Yahweh was, what do we see? What do we see the Jews learning about Yahweh through this story? When the people that would become the Jews hear this story, they hear that Yahweh is not like other gods. Yahweh, in fact, does not demand that we sacrifice our children. And we can know what it is that God demands from us because God has told us. And God has proven that God is faithful. God will keep the promises that God has made. But this God, Yahweh, cannot be tamed, cannot be controlled, is not affected by our sacrifices. This God, Yahweh, is not dependent in any way on our sacrifices. And this makes Yahweh free, makes Yahweh adventurous, and it makes Yahweh quite unsafe. There's a moment in the story, The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, where the children of men they're about to meet the lion Aslan. And so Susan is talking to Mr. Beaver, and this is what Mr. Beaver says. Aslan is the lion, the great lion. Ooh, said Susan, I thought he was a man. Is he quite safe? I shall feel rather nervous about meeting a lion. Safe, said Mr. Beaver. Who said anything about safe? Of course he isn't safe. But he's good. He's the king, I tell you. He's wild, you know. Not like a Tamar.